Hello there, I'm Callum and welcome to the EU in Review, where I review the Star Wars Expanded Universe as I experience it. This time I'm going to be talking about X-Wing, the Krytos Trap. And I'll begin, as always, with the blurb. Star Wars, can the Rogue Squadron survive its greatest challenge yet? They are the galaxy's most elite fighting force, and as the battle against the Empire rages, the X-Wing fighters risk life and machine to protect the Rebel Alliance. Now they face their greatest challenge yet, in the face of the deadliest betrayal. X-Wing, the Krytos Trap. The Rebels have taken Coruscant, but their problems are far from over. A killer virus called Krytos is wiping out the indigenous population, and a counter-revolution is exploding. At the centre of the storm is the highly charged treason trial of rebel hero Tycho Selchuk. Whilst agent provocateurs carry out their acts of terrorism, the fledgling state can be defended only by the blood and courage of the Rogue Squadron. As the X-Wing fighters scramble to save the rebellion, Corran Horn, given up for dead in Azar's inescapable prison, discovers he alone holds the key to freeing Coruscant from the Empire. And just before I start, I will say, indigenous population doesn't sound quite right. I guess that's the feel they were going for, but it's more the alien population, and agents provocate. It should be while Curtin Law's agents and provocateurs or something happens. Anyway, the blurb's ain't long on this one, but yeah, published 1996 and written by Michael A. Stackpole. This book brings a little bit slower pacing than the last two novels, which already had some slower moments in between the battles. So while it won't be quite as much as what you expect from even the previous ones, because you expect there to be more action, it does offer more of the slower moments, and it's really the politics in it that takes the forefront, as from the blurb you can see that there's the treason trial of Tycho Selchuk, and so that features prominently throughout the whole storyline, and to me it felt like it slowed it down, but it was necessary to tell that part of the story. And still feels like just continuing reading the same story. Now, the ideas in this one, it has one of my favourite ideas I'm going to mention in the spoiler section, but ideas are still great in this. Michael Stackpole, done it again. It's brilliant. And the overall plot on paper, just from the blurb, listening to it, yep, you go. They took over Coruscant and they have more problems, and that offers some intrigue, especially if you've read the last novel and go, this is gonna happen. And it mentions each of the cliffhangers from the last novel as well, going, whoa, I was waiting for this, so I'm gonna see what happens, and you don't get disappointed by it either. I found a very satisfactory conclusion, although in some parts I'll go into it in the spoiler section. The dialogue is pretty much the same as the last novel. The style and suitability is all quite on point. I love the bits of humour as well in the dialogue that you don't get all the time, and suitability being used in Star Wars terms and all that good stuff in the novel. It ties into the writing style, where the details are about the right length, as I would see it, for explaining one information that, for me, being a Star Wars nerd, I like to hear a bit more about the ships and things. The details are still really good, and the use of English language in describing everything is really good, because it really feels like you're in that moment, especially in the not as common action scenes. You still feel like you're in that moment, and especially with a lot of the slower moments in between, you get a really good build up, and the information you think you know, and then you can see bits and pieces when you look back at it to go, whoa, that was leading to that, but some parts you realise and some parts you don't, and it depends on what bits and pieces you put together yourself. And for continuity, I don't see any continuity errors in this book either. So they're actually really well put together, especially in the time that they were made, with being before the prequels. I give it a little bit of leeway on continuity because just of timing of things. I really enjoyed this book and it's well worth reading, although you will need to read the previous two for the plot to have the right context and settings and understand each of the characters more. It's really a continuation of the same story, so you should read the first two novels and then read this one, and it's brilliant. I'm loving it and I can't wait for the next one, which is the Back the War. Now into the spoilers section. So I have my notes that I took as I read the book. So it starts off with more of the aftermath of Corin's supposed death, which is good to see. That, well, because it gives a little bit of context with updating where the squadron is at the time as well, because a little bit of time has passed since the taking over of Coruscant. And the addition of squad members for political reasons again feels like it would be something that humans would do on Earth, is like put people in places because of politics. It's good that they have merit for their skill as well. The effect of the Krytos virus is actually terrifying to read. They're really good of instilling that sense of terror and the impact that it's really having on people. That for some species, even stepping foot on the planet is dangerous, or that's what they believe. And it creates a really interesting dynamic with the political structure, and that's something that really shines in this novel, is the political machinations and all of the political. And it does open on a political chapter, which is a cool place to start because it's setting up everything to say how they progress, especially with the great way that it ties in to the formation of the new republic and how they're becoming a government more than just a rebellion and a military. Curtin Law's plan for terrorism are very interesting, I find, and provide a solid antagonistic force that leads me to wonder what will happen, and I do really wonder how will he be defeated, as he seems in a very high place of power. And Wedge confronting the Provisional Council is great to read, in universe politics at its finest, I think, because you have the military man being overridden by the political ones, which is an issue which is very predominant in this book. Leia does mention Hapes on page 25, which is a connection to courtship of Princess Leia, and I love Leia's chat with Wedge and her way of dealing with him, revealing information to him that he didn't even realise that he knew, because she's great that way. Leia has great wisdom, I would say, in that. And page 27, a guard wields a Stockley spray stick, again first introduced in Heir to the Empire, and they also appeared in the previous novel. And the defence of Tycho with the team of Nawara, Vent and Whistler, and the subsequent explanation is great. It gets me excited to read how all of the court proceedings go. And the details about the Iron Fist it goes into as well, which is Warlord Zinger's super class Star Destroyer, makes the Super Star Destroyers sound even more terrifying. Because you see the giant Super Star Destroyer in Return of the Jedi and you go, yeah, it's a bigger Star Destroyer. And then it goes into details on how much weaponry it has and all of that, and you go, oh wow, they're really powerful. It's great. And I thought Gavin going out with Sailor is an interesting development, because Sailor is a Botham, and of course Gavin is a human. And so quite interesting how they go from mentioning the interspecies relationships in the previous novel into it actually happening in this one. and I think it's an interesting subplot throughout the novel. Page 39 references Bothans dying for the second Death Star plans, and of course, forced failure is a nuisance again, because they try to abuse all of their political power and just say, oh, but the Bothans died for the second Death Star plans, we're important, and they try and say they're more important than the others, but they're not. Anyway, the same sort of gripes I would have with some human politics. Anyway, not going to get into that too much, but it's a really realistic way of having the politics set up. And of course, I don't know anyone who likes forced failure. Anyway, Corrin in his flight sequence is very interesting, I thought, with how the Lusankia is playing with his mind of trying to get him to turn on his allies. And that's something that I really like. It's very interesting to read each of the pieces of the Lusankia as the book progresses as well. There's a typo on page 47 where it has X-Wings with an apostrophe on the S when it should be just X-Wing. Yeah, so this introduces Yagdu, the homeworld of the Given species. And its first introduction was in a comic by Dark Horse called Makeup Droid, which is interesting. And so it pulls a little detail from that for the Given. I like how detail is added, like the B-Wing makes Wedge feel less like a pilot and more like a driver. It adds so much depth just with some simple sentences like that we can relate to, because we go, yeah, we feel more like a driver when we're driving our car. And even like the differences with us between driving a bigger vehicle and a smaller vehicle feels quite different, and different types of cars, so you can know you get into his mind and he goes, I'm less like a pilot, more like a driver. Stuff like that really helps getting depth and gives a reason to why he doesn't want to fly a B-Wing and flies X-Wings instead. There is a mission to take the space station. I like reading how it turned out, and that's to get some Bacta. There's a different twist with the enemy surrendering instead of fighting all the way, which I think is good, because it shows that the Empire's a bit in decline and that people are starting to realise that, which is good. And I love the little bit at the end of chapter 7 with Wedge still really caring about Mirax, and Mirax, with no one else to really talk to, he approaches and says, well, I'm here for you. And I love Wedge as well as a character doing those things. He really cares about the people that are on his squadron and helping them out and all that. Because Mirax is basically on the squadron, even though she's a smoker separate. It's one of the crew. And each session with Corrin on the Lusankia just gets more and more interesting for me, with the flight sequence to start with, and then his second flight sequence, but then they're trying even harder, and yet his subconscious and manages to fight back enough to be able to not be completely brainwashed, which is great. I really like that. Now, Wedge liking Ayala here seems... Also, it seems to come a bit out of the blue, with Wedge seeming to start to have feelings for Ayala Wasiri. Because there weren't many scenes with them together to show any inclination of it beforehand. He just sort of starts thinking of it. And it probably would have been good. I know there was a bit of time in between the two novels, but to have a bit more time with Wedge and Ayala hanging out, to be able to start going into more of him developing more feelings for her rather than, oh, I hadn't thought about my feelings, but now I feel like I like Ayala. That's how it sort of feels like it comes out of the blue. But in another way, it doesn't make sense if he's so focused on his missions and then suddenly he goes, I met this woman when I took Coruscant, and just through the combat they grow closer. So it's just the thought of him thinking just seemed to come out of the blue a bit. And I like how at the end of the quiet moments there's usually something coming up to move the plot forwards. And while this novel is a bit slower, there is something even with quieter moments like Wedge trying to go and see Isla that moves the plot forwards in a meaningful way, rather than just, I went there because I thought I liked her and then that won't work out at the moment, sort of thing. Because of course, Isla has Derek. Yeah, sad story that comes up in this novel, but Derek, I'm sure I've got a note on that later. And Curtin Law really, the description of him really does cut an imposing figure. It's interesting how he seems to go after more Vaderian fear, Vader-like fear, than the resemblance to Tarkin that he has, because Tarkin had the fear doctrine that would be quite useful to use. I think here, in the part in the story that I was typing this, is I think here he's starting to see not everything going according to plan with the Bacta taken by Rogue Squadron coming into effect. Like some things, like he's going, oh good, they'll have to use up more Bacta, and that'll cause them more problems. But when they find a solution like getting Bacta, he starts going, that wasn't quite my intention with that. But of course, you can't predict everything, like real life. And I like how it, in a small way also with Curtin Law thinking about Tarkin, it connects back to Tarkin, because Tarkin is a villain that only appeared in the first Star Wars movie, plus other EU works of course, but even the effects of Tarkin are being connected to the later X-Wing books after he's died, which is good. And there was this point in time I was going, there really is no reason to like Borsk's failure. It just keeps opposing what we see, because we've read what Rogue Squadron went through and everything, what we see needs to be done, and just causes more problems. Ugh. Like I said in the previous review, like the more I read about Borsk's failure, the less I like him, the more I hate him. Because he's just... Anyway. Leia mentions Derafor, which first appeared in the Empire Strikes Back audio drama, and it's cool that the New Republic security force is being formed, and it shows that as a government they are setting up even more for all aspects, not just the political side but also trying to control the black market. And of course it's Flori Voru that they bring in to form this security force, who mentions Dirge of the Hutt, which connects to previous works including Shadows of the Empire, because Dirge of the Hutt is one of the Black Sun Vigos, which is really cool, or was at this point in time, and I'm not sure. He's probably holding onto what power he has left, I forget the exact details right now. But it's cool. And it's also interesting how he says that some people went into lawlessness just because of how the Empire treated people. So, knowing what he does later on in the book, of course this is a spoiler section, he ends up trying to play his own game. He's trying to pander to what the Rebellion and the New Republic likes. They like to see, oh, these people might be redeemable if we treat them right. Yeah. And it brings up the point again, it's a really interesting political one, how they have to rely on previous Imperial employees to support the new government, which I find quite interesting, because they say they don't have enough people amongst their own people, so they're pretty much merging in with the people that were working for the Empire to be able to do a lot of the managerial side of things. I love how realistically this seems to play out as far as forming a government goes. What's also cool is that this book introduces the Vratic species, and it's interesting how Callum of the Vratics see touch as the most important sense, while sight and hearing report things from the past, even if that past is a minuscule amount of time, because of course there's the speed of light and the speed of sound, whereas touching someone you gain the sensation immediately for them. Anyway, thinking more about it, they have to have the touch as immediate to where they're touching, but it has to send the signal up to their brain, which also takes a minuscule amount of time to get to, less than sight and hearing. so I guess that makes sense. And on page 99, it's really interesting. It gives a background to how Bacta came about in the universe, which is really cool. It's also interesting how it heals and renders people receptive to mechanical limb replacements. So it's probably similar for Kolto back in the Old Republic, because people had some cybernetic limbs there, but it renders people more receptive to mechanical limb replacements, whereas possibly Kolto didn't. I'd have to look more into Kolto and Bacta differences for that, but it's really cool how it adds in how you can do that. And I love how it explains Bacta manufacture, and the Varakan make sure each of the components are mixed properly, and that makes for a higher quality Bacta than the way that the companies that the Empire put in place on Thifera do it. And that's a whole really interesting subplot in this, as well as becomes more prominent later on that the Empire is influenced with Thifera a fair bit. It's also interesting how the Ratiks have not a hive mind, but a type of subsensory thought transfer, so that they can send thoughts between each other, but it's different to a hive mind like the Achilles have. And I sort of knew they'd be better at mixing the Bacta and making it more effective and now explaining it than the bigger companies, but adding to that, helping with the Krytos virus, and which he offers to do, and seems a huge boon to help the Vratiks. It makes sense. Of course the Thifera nobles, the companies in charge, won't like that as much, but it really seems like Wedge goes, well, I'm going to help you because it's the best way to help millions of people infected with the Krytos virus. And I love the trial section of this after as well. The detail put into it and seeing it from the point of view of Nawara Ven is great. And I like reading how it all plays out, and it's quite exciting. And it's interesting that Iceheart uses a Trandoshan as a guard for Corrin. And I noted that because there's a lot of anti-alien sentiment in the Empire. So Iceheart's obviously using the Trandoshan as a mere guard, but it's interesting that he is a guard there on the Lusanka. That's a nice callback to Empire Strikes Back with the torture rack in the same style that they used to torture Han Solo in Empire Strikes Back. Except for, of course, Iziz improved upon it to be more of a torture thing. And while it's a horrible thing, I do love reading how it all plays out, and the descriptions of how it works are brilliant. Izard's idea of having an Avenger squadron to take on Rogue Squadron is quite interesting as well, I thought, because it's basically like fighting fire with fire. I'm sure that idea will play out a bit more later on in the series. The counter-remote strategy is interesting, sending strong signals out to detonate bombs prematurely. And to come up with some interesting strategies all around to counteract the guerrilla warfare and all that. And here's where we get to Flurry Borrow again. He's running his own scam and even trying to manipulate Curtin Law as an interesting, I call it the subplot, because the main plot is selling Tycho's court cases and the Lysanka and a couple of the other bits. The main bits with the antagonist rather than Flurry trying to run his own thing with Curtin Law, which worked out in the end. It's interesting that the character of Jan, which is an old man also in prison on the Lysanka, is interesting, and that some of the Lysanka's prisoners have been there since the Battle of Yavin is even more interesting, because that means the Lysanka has been operating where it is since in between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope, which is really cool. I love that, and it adds more depth to it. Or at least it started up at the Battle of Yavin when they were taking prisoners. Corrin also meets a prominent figure in the previous rogue book called Every Derricker, who worked on the Krytos virus. And I thought something would happen with him to, like, forcing him to help counteract the Krytos virus, but that is something that didn't come into play later on. It was a theory I had. I was thinking, oh, okay, Callum met him. It might have something to do with helping combat the Krytos virus, but it didn't, because this is my first time reading it as well, so it's quite different to rereading it. Wedge's stress through the ongoing trial and being called up to witness, it just keeps making me more intrigued how it'll turn out. Because, like, he's a military man, but the political trial field is a vastly different battlefield, and he really feels the stress and everything from it. It's cool. And it's funny how they point out that Iziz first tried to get Gavin arrested, then they ended up together. So, Iziz Sailor. It's a full name. Yeah, Iziz the Bothan, they got annoyed at Gavin for not liking furries. Yeah. It's funny. But I like how it shows the growth in Gavin's character. I like how we read from the New Republic perspective about something we know would have been running from the other perspective under Florivaru, and I think this is where the telling the stories from the different perspectives shine, and we see the big picture while each of the characters inside of it don't. As it's really cool that we know that Flori is trying to play them, but the New Republic's going, well, we don't know what's going on and we're trying to find out. And the interplay between Florivaru and Curtin Law is interesting, as Law is put on the spot where he doesn't have complete control of the situation. Whereas he starts off earlier in the novel where he has complete control and he's like, yep, I know what I'm gonna do, this is my plan. But then Varu comes in and goes, well, now you gotta try and get you in a corner. Well, Varu's got him in a corner, he doesn't have control and he's trying to figure out what to do. This book also builds on the lore of Rill, which is from Lyloth, and how there are different grades of Rill, which is a drug, it's a spice. And I like how they introduce different types of things like the Rill core not absorbing light outside of the ultraviolet range, which adds another thing to the GAN's perks. Tip, have a GAN on your crew, they're really helpful. Anyway. I love how it just world builds and just builds up more of the world while looking for something to help with the plot. And I sort of like, it's a good bad thing, and it turns out alright, but like, the Lusankia is built up more and more beautifully to be a horrible place. And it sounds weird to say that, but like the way it's written just really keeps you intrigued and just builds up how much of a horrible place it is for Corin to be in prison, and I love it, but at the same time it's like I never would want to be there. It's great. The Wedge thinking about the Twi'leks fleeing to Tatooine would be a good reference. Could be a good reference to Bib Fortuna, because apparently there's a bunch of Twi'leks that fled to Tatooine, so it's also a great mention connecting to Bib Fortuna later on. It does establish Twi'leks as great negotiators as well, which we're seeing with Navarro then in the court cases, and they interestingly have the different roles play the different parts, which is cool. And on page 194 it mentions that Wedge had a previous mission to Ryloth, which I assume happens in the Rogue Squadron comics. Well, I haven't read yet. And on page 196 it mentions Prefect Barriss, which is spelt the same way as Barriss Offee, the Jedi in the Clone Wars, which is really cool because you got, well, it's cool just for a connection thing. I think it's like reuse names a bit, and you'd think you'd encounter some similar name after so many times. It's kind of funny, but also something we do in creating aliases is that Linudka base his false names after young adult Duros novels that he read, which is a really clever way of doing it. It mentions Viranida again, even after his death in the previous novel, which is cool to see some aftermath from that. So they don't go, oh, he's dead, we don't need to mention him again. It's cool how they have a little bit of an aftermath of that. It's really interesting to hear about the projected deaths had Coruscant been taken only 6 days later. So because of Rogue Squadron being able to get the shields down, the Krytos virus had much less of an effect than if it was taken Coruscant the 6 days later and the virus had been more developed. It's really cool how the droids sort of worked that out from digging on their own, past what normal program would say they were asked to do, but in a way that really helps. And the Varavan, of course, asked them to do digging while he was away on mission. Interesting the way the prison is set up that Callum worked out to have the artificial gravity upside down, I thought. Because that would trick everyone into going, oh, I'm going down, but then that doesn't actually send them to the right place. It's cool. I like how they do that. And the idea that you could have the artificial gravity going 2 different ways inside of the ship is really cool. Now, of course, that was probably made possible because the Lusankia was buried on Coruscant. I'd assume they can do that in the ship as well, though. It has Cien Raina, which connects to Tales from Jabba's Palace, which is really cool, from A Time to Mourn, A Time to Dance, Ula's tale. And she's one of the dancers from Jabba's Palace that escapes and goes back to Ryloth, which I think is a really cool connection. Page 207 is interesting in reference to seeing how the Empire can objectify people. And it's interesting how the Twi'leks break up and pronounce people's names. I really like the explanation they give. It's like, it is interesting though, that it's such a coincidence that Noir Aven means gifted negotiator, and Wedge Antilles means slayer of stars. It's like, it just so happened that they play those roles in the story, and they have such fitting names for it. You wouldn't get that right all the time. Now, there's the intro of Taldira, which is a different sort of ugly. Is interesting because the Ralothian Twi'leks created their own ugly, and it leads on thinking a different way than it is going to end up. And like Taldira is a warrior, and so he has a starfighter. It's cool. Read it for the details. Having a witness that looks through the budgets and expenditures is really interesting, as I know a bit more about budgets and expenditures now because I've been helping with charity work and looking at budgets and all that as a treasurer. And so it's interesting to see, and I like how it's addressing each point of evidence for Tycho methodically, as a court case would. Michael Stackpole put a lot of thought and a lot of effort into writing this in a way that is really cool. It's very interesting that the account set up to frame Tycho happened before with Crick's mating. So they were trying to discredit him, but it has happened before with Crick's mating, who also defected from the Empire. And it's good when it seems that the non-action scenes go on for a bit long, because they go and give the rogues a mission to change it up. Just when it starts to feel like, oh, this is taking a while in these slow moments, they're like, okay, here's a mission just to change it up and give it a bit faster pacing, give you a bit of that X-Wing adrenaline bit. And it's actually cool how Curtin Law thinks of having Boba Fett on retainer. and I think this is the first time he's mentioned in a novel chronologically after his escape from the Salad. That's past him himself being in the Bounty Hunter Wars, of course. This is the first time he's mentioned after that. It also shows Curtis Law's character development by starting to act more independently from Iziz, because he used to obey everything he did, and this is sort of what caused him to fall a bit as well, and he started going, I think I know what I'm doing better than she does, so I'm gonna go and do my own bit. And I thought, Noir Event has heated stockings for his Leku while they're flying to protect him from the cold of space if he's ever ejected. That's quite interesting, I thought. Because I thought they might have a special type of helmet or something to be able to stick his Leku in and whatever. So it's cool how he has that. Little details add so much to the story. It's great. I love it. It says that Rogue Squadron is still one pilot short, yet previous times, and this is only over a couple of weeks, and over like 4 to 6 weeks, but through this time it seems very suspicious as far as they left it open for Cora and Horn, but they didn't know that, and in the previous novel they're like, this person died, we'll get someone else in to replace them. And this time they didn't for Corin. It feels like the author just went, we need to leave the spot open for Corin when he comes back. But yeah. On page 236, there's another mention of the Katana Fleet Fable, which connects to the Thrawn trilogy, Dark Force Rising. And it's cool that the ship Another Chance was mentioned, which connects to Graveyard of Alderaan, which is a West End game story. So it's really cool how there's these connections. And it also says that the shards of Alderaan formed an asteroid field known as the Graveyard, which also connects to the Graveyard of Alderaan. And they mention that the shards of Alderaan formed that in this novel. So it's really cool how they put it and connected it together. I did think it was funny how the Lambda class shuttles are nicknamed Lambs. And it doesn't make sense because Lambda, how it's spelled in that, but yeah. Meh, Lambs. It's very interesting how the convoy was destroyed before the Rogue Squadron got into the system. Very interesting. That's a convoy with more backed. I don't like how the court cases from Noira's perspective as we've followed from his perspective in the trials. It followed Noira's perspective when they arrive at the convoy because we followed his perspective in the trials, and so we're understanding how his mind works a bit more. So it's cool to see how they do that. And it's interesting how the strike cruisers are modular to be able to be modified for different purposes. I thought that was cool. And also a little detail is with a hole being burnt in the TIE Fighter's solar panel, but it doesn't disable it when it's blasted by a blaster bomb. So there's little details like that which add so much realism to it, rather than just he shot the TIE Fighter and just gone. Oh yes, this one. There's some horror things in this. I wouldn't want young kids to read it, because there's a small ship where the people inside were cooked alive. And it's brutal. And I'm going, oh, that'd be horrible. But it's all part of it, and it goes, wow. They really did not hold back in the X-Men series here. It's also very interesting how Law's false Rogue Squadron got decimated by Zinja's forces. So they believe that they killed Rogue Squadron when they hadn't. It's all interesting how the Law, thinking he is doing the right thing, actually caused more problems for Izard's plans. It's really cool. It's really cool how Law doing his own thing caused more issues for the plans overall than if he didn't try to do more. And that's where the antagonistic forces start conflicting with each other and causing problems. Bor's failure mentions grotesque risk, which is connecting back to the first novel of Rogue Squadron. And failure also purposely calls Gavin Galen. Now, The Force Unleashed wasn't out at this time, but I thought, connection to The Force Unleashed, Galen and Marek? Just so happens that they picked that. It's cool. And it's... another thing I hate Boss Failure for is being a nasty piece of work by manipulating Asir to try, or attempting to manipulate her to lie in the report back to the military, which would have caused more issues in the future if she'd actually done what he said. But it's interesting because it's at a point where you go, well, you knew it was going to happen. And you go, well, what she's going to decide? Is she going to decide to go along with Failure's plan or not? And that's a question that gets answered later, which is cool. And someone mentioned previously that Corran seems to escape from the Sankhya pretty easily. And it does seem fairly easy. Especially with the loud banging of the shovel when Derricott attacks him as he's trying to escape. I would think the guards would hear or something more would happen. But it seems like, I guess the explanation is that they believe that the prison's foolproof and that they've had it been there for so long that they've grown so lax about it that no one's figured out the way the artificial gravity works the other way, so... And that would explain how he seems to escape easily. It does come close. And I thought it was interesting that Derricott dies. Every Derricott dies because it makes sense, because I almost thought he might be dragged unconscious back to Coruscant to help combat the Krytos virus somehow. But it leaves you going, okay, there went my thought about what might happen. So what's going to happen now? And you're like, oh, I want to read more to find out. Which is cool. And, oh yeah, there's a really interesting twist at the end as well, near the end. Curtin Law wants to make a deal with the New Republic to protect himself from Izan Izar the best he can, which is a really nice twist to put on it. And I was wondering what was going to happen with the court case because it seemed like everything was pretty bleak and hopeless for Tycho. And... oh yeah, Corran got so close to being found in the cabinets. He hid in a cabinet, a stormtrooper opened it, flashed a light inside, and just happened to be lax enough that he didn't pan it over a bit to see Corran. That's how close it was. So, what? So close, it really builds up the suspense. Well, the Xenoscapes in the library do remind me of James Bond. Or even stretching it a bit, it could be a bit of a THX 1138 reference, because that's George's first movie. It's a bit of a stretch, but I was reminded of graphic displays up, and even thinking about it now, a bit of Blade Runner and stuff, with walls, with screens and stuff. It's cool. It mentions Corvus Minor, which is first mentioned in the last command, and apparently appears later in Izard's Revenge, which is cool. Little things leading to things that will happen later. It's interesting how Corran's relied on Whistler so much to slice into systems that he doesn't have the skills to be able to slice into it well enough himself. And here's where he gives a time frame. Corran's been on the Lusankia for 6 weeks, a month and a half, which is not as long as it sounded like I've read. Like, I thought it was actually longer than he was like it. Yeah. It's great that Corran found his file and then Tycho's file. Just so happened he found the ones he wanted, yeah. But it's important intel that just pops up when he's trying to escape. Just so happens. But it works because he's like, I'm in the library, I may as well look at the records because I don't really have another way out. Or he's looking for a way out and there might be something in there. And he finds it as he goes. It's a good way of doing it. The lift with the Emperor's hologram over it is actually a really cool idea for a concealed exit. Because everyone goes, oh, I'm going to step out of the hologram. but when you stay in the hologram, it actually goes down in the lift, and that's cool. And they mentioned a task force under Han Solo's leadership is going to kill Zinj, which I thought was really interesting. And that will be connecting to a story I haven't read yet, so I'll probably mention it later on. It's also interesting how quickly the public opinion and the court case appears to turn around once the evidence starts coming in of Tycho's innocence. And Nawara's defense showed people how circumstantial the evidence against him is. As soon as they have proof, they're like, before they have proof, they're like, yeah, get rid of him, send him to jail, crucify him, basically. But then when the evidence came out, they're like, oh no, he must be innocent. We never considered that. Oh, that's what it seems like a bit. But of course, that's the public's opinion. Of course, Curtin Law didn't help with that because he tried to build up the public image of Tycho being a traitor. And Fo seems very overconfident, which ends up being his weakness. Of course, that'll probably be in the next book, because he just seems overconfident. Corran seems to end up in the old section of the museum. And it goes back to the Jedi Masters from the Clone Wars, which is really cool. And I love this section. Corran does think 40 years ago was the Clone Wars, but this novel was published before the prequels came out, so I'll give it that leeway for continuity. Because it's really interesting how the statues deface of all the Jedi, and it brings Corran to a place to discover more of his heritage, with Nija Halcyon and how he's a descendant of a Jedi. And this is the first appearance, chronologically, of the silver lightsaber colour that I'm aware of, which is really cool, because Corran has a silver lightsaber. And the double hit to turn it off is a new, different idea as well, I thought. While maybe in later stuff, it's new to me, reading chronologically at the moment. And it's really cool how they add some little details that make sense. And Corran's witty response. I love Corran's humour throughout it. Just he has witty responses for everything. And especially on page 292 when in response to the people finding him and saying, oh, this one has a face, when there's mannequins on the rest. And the rest of it being defaced, of course. And I thought it's great that Astia decided to go with Rogue Squadron and give Wedge the report. But they leave you in doubt. They go, oh, something's happening, and then which way is she going to go? But it's great. I love that she's doing the good thing, the right thing. But something that really breaks your heart is Derek was a sleeper agent that was captured by the Lusankia, and he managed to defy the trigger that caused the bomb to explode when the lift was open. And that's a great part, is like he's such conflicting minds because he loves Ayla, who's gonna kill Ayla if the bomb went off, and so there's that warring inside him a bit, but in the end he ended up killing Curtin Law, which is interesting how it turned out. I thought Curtin Law appearing to die from his perspective was a real spanner in the works, but we know Corran's there with the information, so there's that bit of hope there. I also mentioned speeder bikes with sidecars, which I thought, I want to see a speeder bike with a sidecar like a motorbike. Be cool. I love reading about the proton torpedo's effectiveness against the AT-STs. It causes a devastating effect and destroys them, basically. It's cool. Page 309 has a great description of how the lightsaber dissects one man. I really like the descriptions of stuff. It's cool. And Corran appears. He's on Coruscant, which I guess he may be in the museum, but it appears he was somewhere else where a Moff hoarded artifacts. And just the whole scene with the Lusankia rising out of the ground. It's amazing, I love it. I was just like, oh, just imagine Oh, my imagination is so good. If you saw it in a movie, such a great moving moment as well, that would be. And of course, Corin's entrance into the courtroom is great, because he has the evidence to prove Tycho innocent. And I thought, oof, when Wedge left Iziz and said, just because we can do the impossible doesn't mean we will always win. Now then, later on they revealed that Iziz is the traitor in Rogue Squadron, which I didn't quite see. But I was wondering, I was trying to work out who it was, and well, she was trying to get in bed with Corin and stuff before, and there were the hints towards it. Of course, I was going, I'm really interested in what happens next to the other stuff rather than trying to ponder who's the traitor too much. Hella Etik, which is the defense lawyer, mentions Shizor is a big name that is remembered as one of the worst people, so it connects the shadows of the Empire. And it is so coincidental that by losing Iziz, she left with the Lusantia, they had 2 free spots on Rogue Squadron for Corin and Tycho to come back and make up the exact numbers they needed for Rogue Squadron. I'm a bit like, yeah, I noticed what you did there, Mike. You just did that so that they could join back up again. And then I thought, damn, Iziz set herself up in charge of Thyfera to control the Bacta. And so the Bacta war is gonna go to Thyfera. It's cool, because that's, yeah. And it's nice, the creation of Real Cup or the Vartix Varakan is a good way to get rid of the Kyber virus, because it makes the Bacta a lot more effective. And Mirak's surviving is good too, because they tried to say that, oh, Mirak's died in the convoy or whatever, but she was smarter than that. I didn't really believe she died first, because she appears later. Flory Voru is Thyfera's Minister of Trade. So now he's under Izan's thumb, but he's set himself up where he thinks he's with the winning side, I guess. And it's cool how Luke cameos at the end. He's searching for the Jedi Museum Corin found. And Luke mentions that Leia is on a mission to Hapes, connecting to courtship of Princess Leia, probably. And Luke offers to train Corin Horn as a Jedi Knight, which is cool. And there's a bit more on that later when it comes to the Jedi Academy trilogy and I, Jedi. Which is interesting, as Wedge knows that Luke has grown as a Jedi, and there's more of a gap between Wedge and Luke, because Luke knows all this Jedi stuff that Wedge can't relate to him over. And so they're not quite as close friends as they used to be, because they don't have quite as much in common. And the ending's beautiful. I love the ending. Why, they all just stick it to Borg's failure and say the whole squadron is quitting. Because Borg says, oh no, you can't go after Iziz because of political stuff. And they go, well, we quit. And I love it, I love that. And Borg gets shut down so hard, I'm like, take that, Borg, I hate you. So yeah, that's awesome. That's pretty much it. Like, the ending is great. I really love the book, definitely worth reading. Read the X-Wing series and they're brilliant. And yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed hearing my thoughts about everything, hating on Borg's failure and all that. So I'll see you in the next video. Uru.